Bertrand Russell and scientific empiricism. I'm going to discuss this topic, how Bertrand Russell, uh, how he, along the, if we could classify the tradition of philosophical tradition in terms of continental philosophers as well as analytical philosophers. So, in analytical tradition, you can have empiricists, which were Locke, Hume, Berkeley, which who primarily were of the opinion or belief that knowledge can primarily be derived from experience. And on the other side, there were Descartes, Leibniz, who had who were, whose construction of knowledge was basically rational. Were rational philosophers who thought that experience plus there were ideas which were innate. There were innate principles which were independent of experience, which which constitutes our how we describe knowledge. So, so, and there were people who somehow were in between. Also, people like Kant who somehow wanted to take some elements from both of these two traditions. Since in this lecture I would primarily emphasize on how Bertrand Russell, how he belonged to a particular empirical tradition, modulo that he would also had a viewpoint. He also had influences from other traditions, and how that empirical tradition was later carried on, and its particular influences on the sciences, whether physical sciences, theoretical sciences, our construction of those sciences with regard to our those empirical sciences, or even our very understanding of scientific method, how we describe scientific method, which has very much influenced the 20th century physics, particularly whether we try to define the Popperian thing of and theory is true, which you till it's not, we don't find an counter example which will not make it, which will disprove it otherwise. Falsiability criteria, famously called. So how the very tradition, if I'll just say for Russell, what Russell says, for Russell, even though part of our knowledge which is logically independent of experience, in the sense that experience cannot prove it, is yet elucidated and caused by experience. So the a prioriness of things, maybe this is a statement in his earlier stages, the a priori, the if you have the priori and a priori nature of some synthetic statements. So in analytical statements, there is no, we cannot add anything to an analytical statement, but in a synthetic statement there is always scope of adding something which may not necessarily be corroborated from experience or experimentation or observation or sensation, whatever that may be. So even though for Russell, the even though maybe in a sense he would say that even though part of our knowledge which is logically independent of experience, so is yet in the sense experience cannot prove, is yet illustrated and caused by experience. So even though you cannot say that he had a belief, that even though you cannot prove it directly from experience, but experience is the cause of that very thing, which experience accounts for that maybe thing which you cannot account directly from that experience. Maybe the intuitive or the a prioriness of some other philosophers, he discounts it. But maybe this is a statement in his earlier part of his. So, so if you define knowledge is called empirical when it rests wholly or partly on experience. So that was it. So a priori knowledge is not all of the logical kind. So we have hitherto considered. So the most example of non-logical is the priori knowledge. Is knowledge, for example, the Russell is saying that he's not taking knowledge as, for example, as an ethical value of knowledge. For example, whether knowledge is useful or not, or it's virtuous or not, or there are such judgments which require empirical premises. So he's saying that I'm talking of judgments as to the intrinsic desirability of the things. So in a broader sense, what is empirical science? So general acquired, for example, generally agreed is that physics is an empirical science as contrasted with logic and pure mathematics. So I'm trying to see how, trying to focus debate on how the empirical, being empirical, and how is it related with science, and how it's related with logic and mathematics in the Russellian way. So there are two schools of thought. For example, there were maybe thoroughgoing empiricists who believed that the premises of pure mathematics are obtained by induction from experience. So this is one point. And there are thoroughgoing rationalists who have believed that facts which are we regard as only discoverable by observation could really be deduced from logical and metaphysical principles. So these are two thoroughgoing empiricists and thoroughgoing rationalists. There are two strands. So for Russell, both of them are false. False in some sense, in sense that, so we have to examine that the reason for thinking that there is an epistemological distinction between pure mathematics and pure physics before trying to discover its exact nature. So the claim of pure rationalists and the claim of pure empiricists, of one taking things entirely from experience, and the case of other of taking all observable facts can ultimately deduce from logical or metaphysical principles. He takes both of these states before he is going to. Russell says before giving judgment on them, we should have a proper way of classification, or proper way, the distinctive way of epistemological distinction, how we define pure mathematics and physics before trying to discover its exact nature, before proclaiming something. So, and in continuation of that, he says, for example, if physics has to desert common sense, that is no reason for finding fault with physics. Maybe the commonsensical notions of physics. Maybe in our earlier classes, mirage. If the mirage is not explained by the physical principles, but he has faith that if we extend it, there is something called total internal reflection, and we can explain it from physical principles. So at first principles, if our senses defy the laws of physics, but in a deeper sense, our faith in physics should not flounder in the rational sense. So because if you say the skeptical element, the skeptical origin of our scientific method, when we go to Middle Ages, there was this particular scientist who had written this book on optics, Ibn al-Haytham. He introduced that skeptical element while we are observing things. So if you take it to one extreme, for example, Descartes, but leading, if you take that skeptical element to other extreme, for example, Descartes and Berkeley leading the later to deny matter, while it had an effect, led Leibniz to deny perception. So how we perceive it may also lead to denying perception. So, so how I'm coming to how mathematics and logic and physics, how we can place empiricism. These how empiricism can be placed uh, is that, for example, although physics can be perceived as pure mathematics, it's not pure mathematics. It's not pure mathematics. It's not as pure mathematics that physics is important. What is to be said about logical analysis of physics is therefore only necessary preliminary to our main theme. The laws of physics are believed to be at least approximately true, although they are not logically necessary. Their evidence, the evidence of them is empirical. So it's an important sentence he's saying. So what he says is, I repeat it, the laws of physics are believed to be at least approximately true. So there is no that certitude in mathematical deductions, whether it's a theorem or a particular result. So the certitude a mathematician has, so that in physics we don't have. Even if we have, that may be the pinnacle of our understanding of things. So even the faith the polished the polished product of physics, there is always that skeptical element. Even the finest physicists may not ultimately have faith in their what they achieve as a theory, as a finished product, because there is always scope of incoming observations which is going to not dismantle not them, but there's always scope for reconstruction. It's not as if foundations are always moving beneath, but it's both ways. While in case of mathematics, the faith is absolute. So that's why he is talking. The laws of physics are believed to be at least approximately true, although they are not logically necessary. So the mathematical method is not necessarily that. The deductive, it's not that necessary, and the evidence of them has to be empirical. So here he has given a distinctive difference of what makes physics physics and what makes mathematics mathematics. And physics must be interpreted in a way which tends towards idealism, and perception in a way which tends towards materialism. So that's he is taking it in this way. So the the objects which are mathematically primitive in physics, such as electrons, protons, and points, are all logically complex structures composed of entities which are metaphysically more primitive, which may become so. So the primitive elements with a line, point, plane of Euclidean geometry, uh, they might be statements which are true, which we cannot prove, but we can. The what he is trying to say is that the primitive substrates of the physical which construct the physicality of the world, whether they are electrons, atoms, molecules, galaxies, or whatever. So they are metaphysically more complex than the mathematical way of looking at things. So so here I'll place, there is a particular comment. For example, when we go for so there are propositions known as a priori, and among them are propositions of logic and pure mathematics, as well as that of fundamental maybe propositions of maybe ethics also. So can there be a knowledge of general propositions in cases where we have not examined all instances, and indeed never examined them all because their number is infinite? Maybe I'll place it. Maybe these arguments were brought preeminently by German philosopher Kant. Uh, are very difficult and historically important, because for example, in our construction of a general statement from a particular statement, so the general statement, if it will go from by constructed it from scientific method or induction or mathematical induction. If you take it scientific induction, you take the empirical understanding of particulars, which will always make general statements. So the particular should be empirically evident, which we are going to observe, and whose summation or whose enlargement or whose will lead to a larger general statement. So that but if that particular or that so there is always a scope that the insurmountability of that empirical particular. So we have not tested by case, because the particulars may be infinite, may be very large. So if it's very large or infinite in the sense that it's beyond the compatibility of human thing, that there is always scope of a particular not falling in the line of those empirical particulars. So how we will place a general statement there? So here the Kantian way of looking at the argumentation of synthetic statements, for example, truths of arithmetic, for example, or synthetic, or truths of mathematics are synthetic rather than analytic. So he did not say that 12 is composed of 7 plus 5. The knowledge of maybe 12 is not equal to 7 plus 5, but basically the knowledge of 12 is contained in 7 plus 5. So because the you cannot construct that a general statement. because it's in continuous process of improvisation with the enumeration of those particular statements. So all empirical laws are inferred from a finite number of observations dished out by maybe interpolation or by extrapolation. And maybe Russell, if you say, maybe Russell wasn't strictly Kantian, he somehow was, he took some elements of Kant as well as elements of maybe William James. For example, there's a famous essay of James on radical empiricism. So, how even not only scientific empiricism in terms or mathematical, how we try to see differentiate the mathematical and the scientific part of the empiricism. The way the grand project of Russell was also to psychologically also the sense perception, the idea of percept, how we mind and matter, how we mind perceives matter. And there he was influenced by the idea of radical empiricism by William James, where he, for example, argued that a traditional metaphysical opposition between mind and matter is a mistake, in that they are really just different conceptualization of something intrinsically neutral, which we call experience. Russell took it to that because accountancy typically involves distinctively mental awareness of something non-mental, and it is inconsistent with the neutral monism. And he had originally held that this was one of the reasons for rejecting, maybe in theory of knowledge or analysis of matter. So how he construes maybe psychological, how the empirical understanding of things, the cognitive part of empiricism, which later took a very important idea in the ideation of uh, percept, how mind perceives matter, and the empirical part of it. But maybe there is also one comment which I would want to say. Maybe there were some philosophers. Russell also says that the very idea of maybe observer affecting something which we are going to observe, which was belief of some philosophers. Maybe I don't remember Kant, Berkeley. So our idea of perceiving something, should it remain in the classicals and what we are going to perceive, will it change with our idea of perceiving that very thing? So this debate can be taken to our understanding of classical observer and quantum observer in the physics part of it. But I philosophically, so maybe so this how I'm relating it is to the idea that how the radical empiricism of William James and how Russell basically tried to see the mentation part of it in terms of some empirical way of looking at things. And if you take empiricism to one extreme, for example, Russell says that pure extremism leads to skepticism. So for years being disciple of Bradley, I could no longer believe that, this is what Russell says, believe that knowing makes any difference to what is known, what I was saying before. So many philosophical arguments derived from Kantian arguments were invalid. For example, non-Euclidean geometry had undermined the arguments of transcendental aesthetic. So this is what Russell says. Frege showed that detail how arithmetic can be deduced from logic without the need for any fresh ideas. So it's not logically simplest proportions of the system that are most obvious or that provide the cheap part of our reasons for believing in the system. Maybe that this comment is not, maybe it doesn't connect with what I was saying. So further, what Russell says that I'll just quote him: every empiricist holds that our knowledge, as a matter of facts, is derived from perception. But if physics is true, then there must be so little resemblance between our percepts and their external causes. We can acquire knowledge of external objects. So further, what Russell says, a world which in so now I'm going to connect how his the idea of perception cannot be somehow divorced from the way Russell somehow constructed his idea of scientific inference, and whose very essential ingredients are that of induction, which may be in case of if it's a scientific empiricism, so it's scientific induction, or it may be a mathematical induction. So, but if you take empirical understanding of things and the empirical particulars, because there's always a before Russell takes if he had a in his initial stage, he had a particular faith in Humean empiricism, where you always had a scope for case by case believing in statements and trying to prove it case by case and generalizing it, and a faith that it may extend to as much as possible till you don't have any exception to the rule. But if you take that method or that ideology, so he says there's a problem. For example, a world in which induction is true is empirically indistinguishable from one which is it is false. So you cannot distinguish between true and false, because you are going to repeat the same set of results which are going to reinforce your previous statements. So which will not it's within the system, you cannot prove things which are outside the system. So within this system it seems reinforcing a certain thing again and again. So you are not this is so you are not able to distinguish from what is true and what is false. So and further is that and if you take pure empiricism seriously, it will sometimes leads to skepticism. And for Russell, the skeptical way of looking at things is psychologically, although it's logically impeccable, but psychologically it's not possible as a part of human endeavor. So the valid application of logic of independent inductive inferences must presuppose some contingent principles to guide, justify right kinds of prior probabilities, and the plane of circularity of the principles cannot be justified inductively. So the induction part of it. So induction, which is very essential ingredient of empirical way of looking at things, has some problems in terms of circularity or a priority, so which I'll later talk. So which has its all also its problems. So so further Russell writes, it is generally recognized that inferences of science and common sense differs from those of deductive logic and mathematics in a very important aspect, namely that when premises are true and the reasoning correct, the conclusions are only probable. So it's not that which I had previously also said, that the conclusive conclusions of mathematics, physics, sciences lack the certitude as that of mathematics, which is some. It's not problem for physicists, but maybe Russell, being a mathematician and logician, wanted to articulate it that way. But as a physicist, if you want to say that our understanding is always ad hoc and you are ready for accepting something which is exceptional to the rule, or you are because the even if theoretical physicists in experimental physicists, so they are understanding they are a bit crude, and they may so they are have a heuristic way of sometimes getting to the things. So heuristic method is also as much acceptable for a physicist, theoretical physicist, but not it doesn't may not correspond to the rigor of mathematician or his own faith in that method, mathematical method. Maybe that's why Russell is articulating that the conclusions are only. So he is feeling a bit of discomfort with this thing, which in principle he feels as part of belief system that it should not be there. So I'll now connect the empirical or aspects of Russell with the maybe there are some maybe particular. For example, there were in the late Russell, maybe there were people who be Sellers is there, Quinine is there, Kripke is there. Maybe a lot of people have further taken a debate. I will just quote maybe one Sellers, for example. For example, I'll just articulate what he's saying it. So maybe you can connect it yourself if you are interested to his the previous discussion of empiricism which I was having. So I'm trying to connect the idea of empiricism of Russell, how it evolved later also to our times also. Maybe I'll just state only, for example, for Seller, he says that modern empiricism has a uh, conditioned in large part is conditioned by two dogmas. One is belief in some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in meanings independently of matters of facts, and truths which are synthetic or grounded in fact. So this is how we articulate empiricism. So the other so which maybe Sellers is not comfortable. So the other dogma is reductionism, that belief, true belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experiences. So both dogmas are ill-founded. One effect is supposed blurring of boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural sciences, and other effect is shift towards pragmatism. Maybe so blurring the boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural sciences, and another effect is maybe so for Sellers he's not maybe comfortable with the conclusions, the way empiricism as a philosophy has developed into many branches. So so maybe going more from speculative mathematics to natural sciences and pragmatism. So maybe this is one way empiricism has evolved. Maybe the other, so this is one way. So maybe people from linguistics may appreciate it more. But what I am going to concentrate is on the Popperian way of looking at scientific empiricism. So which has very much as a significant maybe overlaps. Maybe he has overlaps with a Russellian way of looking at empirical way of looking at things. But it also has a significant influence on the scientific matters of the contemporary science. And little I will try to connect it with some contemporary sciences of our times. So for Popper, if he studies books, so what he says that a scientist, whether theorists, experimentalists, puts forward statements or a system of statements and tests themes step by step. In the field of empirical science, more particularly, he constructs hypotheses or system of theories and tests them against experience by observation and experiment. So he is going to test any theory against, so maybe the empirical part of it is that empiricism. So he tests them against empiricism, experience. So experience by observation and experiment. So this is the essential ingredients of how we define empiricism also. So in the eyes of upholders of inductive logic, the principles of induction is of supreme importance for scientific method. So as for Reichenbach, he quotes Reichenbach, it determines truth of the scientific theories. So if you take this understanding of how we test a theory plus the idea of inductive logic, so this is how, in the words of Reichenbach, determines truth of the, these are the two essential ingredients, how we describe truth of the scientific theories. So the logic, Popper says the logic of probable inference or probable logic leads to either an infinite regress or the doctrine of a priorism. So which was also previously in the Russellian view when he had a particular understanding of induction. So the a priori-ness of the logic of probabilities of what constitutes the a priority of those postulates. So Russell had a different take as compared to Keynes and maybe Bayes and other philosophers and mathematicians. So he would give some truth value to the a priori-ness of a particular. It should be value neutral or it should be loaded. But for Popper, he says that the logic of probability inference or probability logic leads either to infinite regress or to doctrine of a priorism. So distinction between psychology of knowledge, which deals with empirical facts, and logic of knowledge, which is concerned only with the logical relations. So this is how Popper articulates it. So the problem of finding a criteria which would enable us to distinguish between empirical sciences on the one hand, and mathematics and logic as well as metaphysical systems on the other hand, I call this problem of demarcation. So maybe this is how Popper reformulates maybe old his in a way with a certain degree, how he tries to formulate or articulate it, maybe how we can say what is science and what is not science, or stricter his Popperian understanding of how he defines science, which has somehow dominated maybe large from 30 40. It has a good influence how we define science. So the criteria for it means which would enable us to distinguish between empirical sciences on the one hand and mathematics and logic as well as mathematical systems on the other. I call this problem, he says it's demarcation. So he himself says the problem was known to whom who attempted to solve it. With Kant, it became central problem of theory of knowledge, and it following Kant we call it problem of induction. So so he himself says Hume's problem we might call problem of Kant's problem. So the implied criteria of demarcation is identical with the demand of inductive logic. So, so for a Popper metaphysics, he doesn't. For example, the earlier rationalists maybe they had a belief that all the empirical and statements can ultimately be derived from logical and metaphysical principles. But for Popper, so his definition of metaphysics has usually been defined as non-empirical. He doesn't take metaphysics with the domain of, he doesn't want to link empiric, he somehow doesn't feel any link, he takes a link between empirical and metaphysics. Now, taking experience as a method, for example, there must be many theoretical systems with a logical structure very similar to the one which at any particular time is accepted system of empirical sciences. Theory of knowledge whose talks is analysis of method or procedure peculiar to empirical science may accordingly be described as a theory of empirical method. So theory of knowledge, maybe how he defines knowledge is whose task is analysis of method or procedure peculiar to empirical science. So he is restricting the scientific method to the empirical method, and may accordingly be described as a theory of empirical method. So his scientific method, he somehow overlaps with the his way of defining the empirical method. So for him, empirical method and scientific method can, the definitions can interchange. And the theory of what is usually called experience, or that also includes experience in the commonsensical terms. So, but the for example, now the question is, for example, there is a problem. For example, the problem of empirical basis. If we base our argument only on empiricality of the things, for example, he says scientists scarcely has an occasion to describe a singular statement as non-empirical or metaphysical. For example, any controversy, for example, scientific objectivity and scientific subjective conviction. For example, any controversy or the question whether an events which are in principle unrepeatable and unique ever do or cannot be decided by science, it would be a metaphysical controversy. So if something, so if you have a certain belief system, or if you have a certain postulate or an idea which there is no scope you are going to verify it or to prove it true or untrue by empirical methods. So does it does it disapprove of the truth validity of that original statement if you cannot empirically prove it by cases method? So this is a problem, because in science we normally talk of other principles of objectivity, which is also maybe shared subjectivity. The one important thing in science is that of reproducibility. If you have a certain result, scientific result or empirical sciences, is that you should be able to, if there's an experiment done in Delhi, in and maybe in Kashmir, in New York, everywhere, you should be able to reproduce that Millikan oil dope experiment, for example. The value of it should be able to reproducible everywhere or any part of the universe or galaxy. But what if You cannot, for example, a certain idea, there is no, it's out of the regime. The way high energy physics or modern day sciences of string theory have developed, maybe the very range of testing those very things is beyond our thing. So should our patients be held responsible that we are not patient enough, or should we leave our original idea or a principle which might seem logically or philosophically or in whatever way plausible? Should we leave that, or should we be more patient enough? Or there is also something fundamental thing. For example, we say normally we try to recreate Big Bang in experiments. I don't know, but a Big Bang cannot. The experiments of cosmology, maybe the thing which has happened has happened. You cannot recreate a Big Bang. So the idea of reproducibility is also maybe in the Popperian paradigm, the idea of testing things in an empirical way. So there is some problem also. And I feel personally maybe the pessimism is also associated. So you are the fundamentally in Popperian methodology, the problem is you are basically primarily a pessimist. You always want, or even the methodology scientific, you try to disprove things. So you're not trying to you're not interested in proving the things. No, you start with a positive frame of mind. Maybe you want to. So maybe the statement of Popper is also maybe you can also collaborate by a statement of maybe Eddington, who says that theories are like maybe Eddington or some other person, I don't know. Remember, theories are nets which catch fishes. The moment you make nets, meshes finer and finer, you can catch smaller fishes. So you are going to restrict. You are always going to, as if restrict your thing towards. You are going to narrow it down in some restrictive sense. This is one way of looking at it, Popperian way of looking at of scientific method, which has a significant or how he has appropriated scientific method and the empirical method. Maybe a Russellian way of looking at things. Russell also has some overlap with Popper, maybe, but in terms of a prioriness of the inductive assumptions, maybe there may be finer divergences, which needs a deeper inspection on or introspection. So what Popper says, I have tried to show that the problems of both classical and modern theory of knowledge, from Hume to Kant to Russell and Whitehead, can be traced back to problem of demarcation, which I was saying, the way he says demarcation. That is the problem of finding the empirical criteria of the character of sciences. So he is including all of these people. Maybe even Whitehead also. But here, maybe Whitehead is slightly, his position is a bit nuanced as compared to other Kant, Russell, and Whitehead. So he clubs them in, can be traced the problem, that is the problem of finding empirical criteria of character of sciences. So he clubs them together in saying that how we define the empirical criteria of character of sciences. So now he comes to theories, which I was also saying previously. Theories are nets which cast to catch fishes. Catch to call what we call the world, to rationalize, to explain, and to master it. We endeavor to make mesh finer and finer. So the term prediction used here comprise statements about past, retroductions, or given statements which we wish to explain. So strict statements, pure statements, whether universal or existential, are not limited to space and time. They do refer to individuals, restricted spatio-temporal region. So this is the reason why strictly existential statements are not falsifiable. So maybe when Popper talks of metaphysical statements outside the domain of empirical reasoning, so here he is giving the reasons why he says them. They are non-empirical, strict or pure statements, whether universal or existential, are not limited to to space and time. They do not refer to individual, restricted spatio-temporalism. This is the reason why strictly existence statements are not falsifiable. So he has his this reason why they cannot be taken as metaphysical statements, cannot be falsifiable. So the falsifiability criteria has been very much there in the current sciences also, how we discuss, for example, in string theory or our understanding. So maybe you need particle accelerators to the size of solar system to explain, to predict the verifiability of current theories, string theories. So no nation can afford. Maybe the but the decisive paradigm was that of Popper. You always are going to test a theory to higher ranges, to higher energies, and proving things by counter example. A theory is true till it's proved otherwise. So maybe the method, the scientific method or the empirical method. So how we define science and our understanding of science. So it need to we have to revisit them, and not necessarily through these false viability criterias, which had some value to them, but to my understanding they have some limitation. So maybe the other people maybe have, for example, articulated. So if you take empirical basis, if you take it in terms of the way Russell took it, in terms of debate of mind and matter, how we want to see it. For example, in terms of mind, how we want to see empiricism, in terms of perceptions. So perceptual experiences as empirical basis. So this I will not say dogma, or this thought. This is known as psychologism. If you want to see perceptual experiences as an empirical basis. So doctrine that empirical sciences are reducible to sense perceptions and thus to our experience is one which may be which many accept beyond all question. However, this doctrine stands or falls with inductive logic and is here rejected along with it. So the demand that all statements are to be logically justified, described with Fry's as a predilection of proofs, is bound to lead to infinite regress. If you have to avoid infinite regress, so maybe there are problems faced on his dilemma. He's talking of maybe Popper in his book. He talks of dilemma of dogmatism versus infinite regress versus psychologism. So if you, there are inbuilt problems in empirical way of defining things in terms of perception also, because sometimes giving truth value to the inductive inferences, truth value, giving value to the a prioriness of those assumptions may sometimes lead sometimes you to infinite regress if you give equal value to probabilities, or it may lead to dogmatism, or other problems are also there. The Russell has dealt his own ways, and Popper has tried to address, has reached to some different conclusions, and other people gave different things to the same thing. So one thing I just maybe I forgot to say about is like, mm, so in a scientific method, when maybe there is a particular statement, maybe by Bertrand Russell, no, not Bertrand Russell, maybe Albert Einstein in his book Scientific Evolution of Physics. He's saying that he has made a very good relationship between classical physics and quantum physics, or a certain theory, a particular theory which is a limiting case of an the incoming theory, because a big a theory which is explaining the facts of the previous theories, as well as to something additional, we accept that as true. Maybe classical mechanics, maybe in limiting cases, as a particular case you can study it as a case of a quantum mechanics. So how But should we leave the older formalism in the face of a newer formalism? So one way of looking at it is the Einstein way. He says that when you go to a mountain, so you have some, so you have some staircases. So you travel on those staircases and you reach to the top of hill or a house or whatever. But if you go from the top, the moment you go up and up, when you go to the top, the ground beneath, you will still see that staircase, even though that the base on which you just went ahead, up and up, that may look smaller and smaller, but you will be seeing it there. So this is one way of looking at things. The neighbor theory will be the limiting case of a particular theory in a newer theory. So there will be some elements definitely in that very newer theory. But for Popper, he gives some different examples. Maybe he says that, so it's like you are in a marshy land, so there are tiles. So the tiles on which you stand up and you are above. So till the construction of house you are making, so that till the house is stable, so you are not bothered whether the base on that marshy land, that number of tiles, whether they are stable or not. The moment the house will be shattered or it will be unstable, you are going to go and look for the base. So you are going to see it. So that's why, so if till there is not an uncomfortable fact or an event or an observation which is going to just come otherwise, which is just going to contradict our previous theory, you are not going to revisit your foundations. So this is the inverted way of looking at it. Maybe how we construct our how we have mm, how we basically construct our how we make our scientific how we make our the house of our scientific theories, the base of it. These are two ways of looking at things. And regarding the, for example, for Popper, the class of, so maybe I have not included Russell in this thing. Maybe Russell's he was more interested in the relationship of scientific method and mathematical method, and the problems of juxtaposing one against the other and articulating those very things. One addition I would rather say of Popper is when he says that the class of potential falsifiers of all tautological and metaphysical statements are empty. So maybe Popper had a particular repulsion for these maybe tautological and metaphysical statements. So they are outside that set. So they are always empty. So now another thing maybe of Popper, which maybe Russell has also talked of, maybe when we talk of something called simplicity, maybe whether you take of induction or deduction, interpolation or extrapolation towards a generalizing a given statement towards a certain law or a statement. So there is always the we talk of in simplicity. So maybe that simplicity, to quote, maybe the truth should be simple, not simpler, maybe, but that simplicity is simple, but it's not that simple, in the sense that how we take this construction of simple. For example, Herman Weyl says that the problem of simplicity is of central importance for the importance of the epistemology of natural importance, natural sciences. So this simplicity, the idea of simplicity, for example, it may be, there may be partly practical reasons for it, partly maybe aesthetic reasons for how we invoke the notions of simplicity in the formulation of a certain hypothesis or a result or a theory. So, how maybe simplicity, for example, if there are maybe simplicity means there are not enough parameters which are going to dial and which will make this number of parameters which will make the system complicated. So, if there are less simplicity means less parameters. If there are less parameters, there is a high probability you are going to observe an event or not. Or if there's a and there's a testability is also possible in the Popperian sense. You can test a theory in a simpler way. So if there is a high improbability, there means there is a paucity of parameters and there is a simplicities of things. So from this, Popper concludes that there is high simplicity means high testability. If you test things, means high testability means high simplicity. So maybe the idea of simplicity and testability, which is one of the ingredients of Popperian methodology, maybe how we construe simple. For example, you always take a circle as a limiting case of a ellipse. Maybe circle is more simpler while so the ingredients of this empirical methodology or scientific methodology via Russellian methodology also. Maybe Russell is also maybe interested in sometimes aestheticity of maybe he is interested in that minimalism, in Okumenian sense, that of reducing the mathematical postulates or mathematical statements to premises to some minimal assumptions, might have some aestheticity to it. But he would sometimes maybe as compared to, I don't know, Popper, he sometimes would want to sacrifice the beauty of the simplicity for the larger sake of truth. But in case of Popper, maybe he has in his construction of scientific methodology or empiricism, the idea of simplicity, he is somehow devoting some faith into it and revisiting the epistemological foundations of the same by different schools of thought. So I'll just maybe I'll come to it. So now, how we just visualize empiricism to maybe uh, summarize it. So empiricism is a family of theories which is in one, according to maybe this scholar A.G. Grilling, what he says, empiricism is a family of theories which in one or another way may locate the source or at least the test of contingent knowledge in experience, since specifically in sensory experience. In a qualified sense of this broadly characterized position, Russell was empiricist, and his epistemology remained in that qualified sense empiricist, though through its development. Also critical of the forms of empiricism also. Maybe there were certain forms of empiricism taken by logical positivists and others, of which Russell was not particularly appreciate. So Russell was somehow he wanted to maintain a nuanced distance with them. So also critical of forms of empiricism. Also, the chief reason for this was that his overarching concern was the question of how science is related to subjective experiencing, beginning in the work done with the attempt to show the fundamental concept of physics can be derived from experience. So that was his aim. How the attempts to show that fundamental concepts of physics can be derived from experience, how experience and physics are somehow related. So that was his aim. And that was that he and shifting attention to the questions of non-empirical features of knowledge acquisition required for bridging the gap between experience and sciences. So he was not also maybe materialistic in his, what I should say, metaphysics also entirely. If you read from principle of mathematics to human knowledge, so he was consistent. Maybe his concern was not that of maybe. So his main aim was justifying science by grounding it in experience and showing how physics succeeds in being an empirical science based on observation and experiments are two different aims. And Russell's maybe aim was of later. Means physics succeeds in being empirical science based on observation and experiments are two different aims. And Russell's was the later, means observation and experiment. This is how physics should go. Maybe his this way of defining physics. So he did not see epistemology's primary task to be the defense of science against doubt, but demonstrate how finite human subjectivity acquired knowledge of the objective reality which science describes. So this was his way of characterizing things. So maybe I'll just come the way I started, the way Russell tried to define. Maybe that was his earlier statement. How Russell only wanted to characterize physics or knowledge only in terms of experience. But maybe there is another statement of Russell. For example, in one of his letters, he says the sort of thing that interests me now is in the sense that is that some of our knowledge comes from sense, some comes otherwise. And what comes otherwise is called a priori. So he is not the traditional distinctions of priori and a priori. So he calls it otherwise. And some comes otherwise. What comes otherwise, he calls a priori. Most actual knowledge is a mixture of both. The analysis of a piece of actual knowledge into pure sense and a pure a priori is often very difficult, but almost always very important. So Russell had chosen both parts of the task, to trace the transition from sense to science and to isolate the a priori elements of the later and to axiomize them as a preparation for defining central concepts. What are the central concepts? Space, time, causality, matter itself. Maybe so he's the way he would categorize the other as the uncomfortable other, which was a priori previously. Maybe he takes it to background, and maybe to isolate the prior elements of later and axiomize as a preparation for defining the central concept. So again, maybe in his later stages, the uncomfortable a priori, which he takes as other, he still wants to take it as a background, and maybe his primary aim was to axiomatize them as a preparation for defining the central concepts. What are the space, time, causality, and matter itself. So the business of defining fundamental concepts of physics appeared to be a straightforward parallel to define fundamental concepts of arithmetic. It quickly transpired that the relation of sense to science was not easy to carry out, and moreover that it was necessary primitive to logically constructing the concepts of physics from whatever primitive concepts could be discovered. For example, in fundamental areas of physics, electrodynamics, classical mechanics, maybe other things. So maybe now I'll just try to conclude. So maybe which I have not talked. Maybe I have talked, but there are limits of empiricism. Maybe what Russell says. So empiricism may be regarded as assertion or that all synthetic knowledge is based on experience. So knowledge is a subclass of true beliefs. So it's argued that anything inferred from piece of knowledge by demonstrative argument is knowledge. Given an argument which is known premises confers probability, a certain conclusion that if premises embrace all the known relevant evidence, the conclusions has a degree of credibility maintained by. So maybe the the inferred knowledge from experience, from a piece of knowledge by a demonstrative argument, which is called knowledge. So what we call demonstration, you have to demonstrate things whether by mathematical method or by scientific method, or even when we talk of some self-evident truths, that's also very loaded thing. There are some self-evident truths, or maybe how we are going to demonstrate a certain thing, whether by induction or by deduction. So the empirical way of there are subtleties of the empirically trying to encompass things in a very neat and clean way, which will strictly adhere to the definitions of the which will strictly try to what I should say, the way we have defined empiricism, that all knowledge is ultimately to be explained from experience only. Because experientiality of things is always subject to the conditionalities of time and space, limitations of data, and also limitations of an observer, also maybe limitations of the state of the observer, which is sometimes encoded in the a prioriness or the uh, truth value of those probabilities, the value we give to those probabilities, which are essential ingredient of the inferential part of it. And maybe there are also some other questions maybe which Popper somehow offhand would want to take the metaphysical and the other aspects, existential aspects, some truth statements which he has overtly articulated, don't construe the experientiality, how we define experience. Even though Russell would only take the things which is not immediately described by experience, it is can be traced, or you can say it is born from experience. But for Popper, he will not even take them. The truth, the metaphysical or existential statements are out of the domain of experientiality, or the way we define the empirical, how we construct the very word empiricity of the things. So I rather just to conclude by saying that Bertrand Russell, the way he has, even if you the last part of the limits of empiricism, he has tried to articulate the problems of empiricism and the very debate of empiricism, which is maybe Russell was initially he felt that he was interested in science, but he took a good part of his time, which we will normally call a philosophy of science. So, what philosophy of science he was maybe primarily converted, or I will not say converted. He engaged with the idea of empiricism as a philosophy in and out. And that empiricism, in a restricted sense, you can also take it to the scientific empiricism, and how scientific empiricism has evolved, that criteria of falsiability, or how we construct the basic scientific method, is a very maybe a debate which is still relevant. Maybe in our times also, maybe there are a lot of things, the way evolution of science in 20th century, string theories, and have evolved. Maybe there is an essential debate of what we think, what is science fundamentally. So, so, so if you are going to redefine the definition of science in 20th century, so, so the empiricism, how we define empiricism or scientific empiricism, and that, and how we are going to, for example, judge a veracity of a theory or not. So, is the empirical way of understanding the things the only way of looking at things, or I will not say only way of seeing things? Does it have some limitations? One is the what I was talking of, the limitations of maybe if you try to prove or disprove a theory in Popperian sense. One is that do we lack patience? Method is true, but we lack patience, or we lack resources, or our lifetimes are too small, or is there a problem in terms of method also? So I'll just maybe stop and maybe I'll just see it. I'll just move. It's a very interesting debate how the scientific method and empirical method, how much their definitions can be exchanged, or scientific method and empirical method. So, in the wake of things, do we need a further, we need an addition or rejection, or to it the dialogue, which was maybe not started by Russell. Maybe Russell was one of the important link in the 20th century who addressed this question in his own logical, mathematical, and empirical way. I would rather say in an empirical. I'll end it.